Enter Night City, a world where money is by far the most important thing to have. As beautiful as it looks from the outside, it's a pile of shit from the inside, rotten to its core. From the very start of the show, we see people lost on their streets in their own hedonism, essentially sedated by the various forms of entertainment available to them. It's a grim reality, and it's only made worse by the one canon event in this show. Gloria's death, and especially why she died, is a perfect representation of the world and Night City. A random shooting on the street, an accident, trauma team completely ignoring her, which leads to her getting a doctor just that little bit too late and eventually leads to her dying. It's really just a tragic story. The high execs in Night City have everything. MaxTac gets to them much quicker, the trauma team gets them the required care they need in basically no time, whilst the masses and the common folk in Night City have none of these privileges. They instead have to cremate their dead instead of burying them to save cost. The common man in Night City has no value. People die all the time in this world, and we only care about Gloria's death because it was the death of our main character's mother. That's the kind of city it is. Enter David Martinez. Weak, poor, and backed into a corner. We learn very early on how rough David's situation is. Their household is poor, and Gloria could only barely earn enough money to send David to Arasaka Academy. The moment Gloria dies in this freak accident, though, is when the story of Cyberpunk Edgerunners really begins. David is left with absolutely nothing. No hope, no money, and no power. So then, being in the situation he was left in, installing the sandevistan into his spine was the only choice he had. I mean, what else was he going to do? Die? Be broke and homeless like the other people we see on the street? No. No way. The sandevistan was David's only hope, and after he installed it in a desperate attempt to survive, we learn that David is special. Special enough to use a military-grade implant 9 times a day when most people would crumble using it just twice. David with his sandevistan got a second life in a world that abandoned him, and David certainly made the most out of it. He went from surviving to living, growing in the Edgerunner ways. This was all he ever wanted to do. Things looked a little shaky at the start, but within a few missions, David got used to his new powers and the work itself. He was getting a lot better quickly, and with the guidance of Maine, he was well on his way to becoming an Edgerunner legend. It was all so perfect for him. During one of their missions, Maine starts falling apart. He loses control of himself, loses control of the mission, and ends up surrounded by MaxTac in his final moments. Nothing could save Maine anymore, not even David with his speed. What follows after Maine's death is an arc that only seals the deal. We see David stepping up to become a leader. The pressure was a lot, the competition was fierce, and the stakes were higher than ever. There was a lot more resting on David's shoulders. And yes, that isn't just in regards to the massive fucking arms he got in this episode either, but yes, he did seem to pack a lot more chrome, and he was still completely fine. There was him using the sandevistan with a bunch of other smaller implants, and he seemed better than ever. David had seamlessly transitioned into the role Maine left behind, helping out rookies, working with his squad, and enjoying the fruits of the Edgerunner lifestyle. He could finally be proud of what he'd achieved.
大丈夫。すぐ収まるから。
変わらないね。また人の夢を背負って生きてる。気持ちはわかるけどさ。
Time was up for young David. He'd pushed himself hard enough. Reaching for the stars only ever got him so far in this cruel world. In the end, just like everyone before him, he got burned. He fell into a trap, got his entire team killed, and fell into cyberpsychosis. He'd lived out his legend in Night City, defying all odds, overcoming his trials, and living a life he could truly be proud of. In the end, David died with a smile on his face, knowing that he could save Lucy and send her to the moon. David died as a hero. Or did he? Cyberpunk Edgerunners is a tragedy, but not in the way you think. This show isn't a nihilistic view of a broken world where one man meets his inescapable fate. It's a show where one man gets an opportunity to maybe leave his mark on the world and he dies in the pursuit of that dream. This story is an exhibition of people like David. The people lost in a dream of being exceptional, of being heroes. It's a tragedy of following the path Night City lays out for people just like him. In reality, David was no hero. He was just a man living out his selfish life, one that appeared selfless from the outside but on closer inspection only caused hurt to everyone around him and led himself down the path of doom. He may have died a hero, but only to the disdain of everyone else, much like every other hero before him. But first, who even is David Martinez? He's a vagrant. We see very early on how much David doesn't care for the rules of society. He's helping sell questionable BDs at school, and generally he has a level of contempt towards the systems in place. The very first time we see this is when he thinks it's a good idea to game the system and get a hacked module for school instead of paying for the real thing, which then subsequently leads to his mother dying. Now, of course, I'm not directly blaming him for his mother's death, but it's just one of those things where his stupid actions just had a big consequence. He also believed he was better off getting a job than studying at Arasaka Academy, which isn't necessarily contempt towards the system, I agree, but it is a general naivety that he had towards the world. David was a small kid in a big world. Combined with this naivety and contempt, David had a fascination towards the Edgerunner lifestyle. The show literally starts with him experiencing the final moments of a cyber psycho, and he comes out on the other side of that experience with a thrill towards that, a fascination. We also see this with the respect he shows the other Edgerunners in the show, and of course we see this with the respect he shows to Maine. David wants to live the Edgerunner life. No matter how dangerous it looks to us as the audience, David sees all the risk it entails and he wants to be a part of that. Edgerunners is a story of David getting driven to the edge of a cliff, making one very stupid decision to install the sandevistan. With the second life he gets from that though, he lives out the rest of his story as a hero. I mean, just for 1 second, we do need to talk about the decision of installing the sandevistan itself. It's just such a massive gamble. David had literally seen what that very implant had done to James Norris in episode 1, and sure, his back was against the wall in some ways, but this gamble is one I don't feel like the show justifies all that much either. Yes, David didn't have many options, but he could have tried to find work like his mother did, or he could have even sold off the sandevistan for a cheaper price and tried to make do with that money. And yes, those are the less cool and exciting options, but they were definitely options that David had. Installing the sandevistan was a naive and selfish choice. It was one where if it didn't work, David would simply go into cyberpsychosis and waste his entire life away. That being said though, it did work. He did manage to get the sandevistan and it was a massive blessing for him. What came with the powers of the sandevistan though was a life that was somehow still equally sad. A life of thinking that he was special, thinking that he could do everything and protect everyone, shouldering on more responsibility than he ever needed to, choosing to ignore the one thing everyone else in his life ever wanted to do, which was for him to survive, to live. David loses sight of himself very early on. He enjoys the idea of being an Edgerunner way too much, likes the part where he's special a little bit too much, and ignores the people that really care about him, the first of which is Lucy. Lucy, ever since she started getting along with David a little bit better, only ever wanted one thing from him. For him to be safe. For him not to risk himself. Lucy definitely understood that David was the kind of person to sacrifice himself for others. This scene in episode 4 is a beautiful showcase of Lucy's understanding of David and her plea to David to stay alive. It's the first of many times Lucy's helplessness in the story is shown.
そうじゃない。あんたはいいサイバーパンクになれると思う。この世界で名を残す方法はどう生きるかじゃない。どう死ぬかよ。死んでほしくない。
Knowing all of this about David was never going to be enough. All her pleas were only ever for deaf ears. Just as desperately as she didn't want David to die, David wanted to become a hero. To die as a legend. This manifests one of many ways in the show, but the first of which is in episode 6. David ignores Lucy's advice to run away, runs into a building full of MaxTac and Maine going cyber psycho, and risks his own life because he thought he could make a difference in a situation that was so clearly doomed. Just as a hypothetical, even if the situation wasn't actually that doomed and Maine got out a different way, then that just means that David is stuck in a building with MaxTac surrounding him, which is a risk that he really doesn't need to take. It also happens when he starts shaking in episode 7. Lucy in the following episodes begs him to lay off the implants, to relax, so his neurons don't get fried. Yet that was never an option for young David. He was special. He had to do everything. He knows he has to overcome this problem and become a hero. There was still so much more to do. It was all just one big delusion that David could never abandon. In the end, David even went as far as to sacrifice himself to send Lucy to the moon. But this isn't exactly the happy ending that it is. Lucy would have never wanted this outcome to happen. I know for a fact that she would rather have David next to her than him being dead and her being on the moon. Rebecca was also a character that always cared about David, but it's almost comical because David never once listened to anything Rebecca had to say. All the pleas from Lucy and Rebecca were always just useless. They could never get David to stop chasing his false dream. David's belief of himself being special was just that little bit too strong. Yes, he was more adaptable to the implants than the average person. Yes, that did give him an advantage, but it was never really enough. You know what character David ignored more than Rebecca and Lucy though? Maine. Maine was special. He was a good leader, he took care of business, he cared for his people, he was strong and accomplished. Yet what did that all really mean for him? It meant loading himself with bigger and stronger implants and overreaching until his body and brain couldn't take it any longer. Maine could also have stopped at any given point. He could have given up on his quest to become a legend and continued living. Yet he never really did. Maine was David's biggest warning in this story. He's someone that David should have looked at and reconsidered his own path. He practically had his fate written out in front of him with the choice to turn back or at the very least to stop running. Instead, what did David do? He blamed himself for the death of Maine. Which is even more crazy because in this example I do genuinely believe that Maine's death is no one else's fault but himself. It's Maine's fault. Yes, David might have messed up the mission or whatever, but at the end of the day, Maine chose to keep loading himself with the implants and sent himself into cyberpsychosis. David blamed himself for the death of Maine, tried to become like him, and died fulfilling those self-imposed duties. Much like we saw in the final moments of Maine, the image of him running until there was no more running to do, that's pretty much what happened to David. A similar ending to a similar person.
せいぜい伝説ってやつにでもなりな。ありきたりのな。語り継いでやるよ。
The ending to the show is a brutal reminder of this message. David's overreaching, his overconfidence had finally reached the end of the road. Even after he got a stronger implant, even stronger than the sandevistan, he still wasn't even a match for the truly special Atom Smasher. David may have thought he died a hero's death, but in reality it was a futile ending to a futile life. One of many stories in Night City. David's story after installing the sandevistan is a brutal reminder of thinking that you are special, where all the running towards a fictitious goal only brings pain to you and the people around you. You know, this could have really been one of those things where both sides of the argument are compelling, like who's really at fault, Night City or David? But I don't know, this doesn't really feel like that. David as a person just doesn't feel helpless enough for it to be the case, and Night City, even though it's a complete hellhole and led to all the decisions in some way or the other, still doesn't feel like a complete dystopia. Here's where I stand on this whole story. This journey could have taken us in many different directions. David was almost never forced to do something that he actually chose to do. He probably could have asked his mother Gloria for the money again before he decided to get the hacked module for school. It's even shown that they literally had the money the second time around. He could have not installed the sandevistan into his spine, he could have just found other work or sold out to sandevistan. I think it's one of those things where the show makes it look a little bit more desperate than it really is, but in reality it was still really David's choice to install it. He could have maybe even considered after getting the sandevistan to not go back to school and get revenge on his classmate, because, you know, I probably don't need to explain that one. He could have not joined Maine's team, he could have not want to be a good edgerunner so desperately, he could have done many different things. You kinda get the point, right? Every single thing David does in this story is a consequence of who he is, but also what he really ultimately wanted to do. It was his selfish desires, his naive ambition, and combined with his grit and resilience, it ultimately became his death sentence. Even in the final arc of the show, David could have simply just laid off the implants. He could have escaped his fate of cyberpsychosis, he could have turned back and stopped running, but he never really did. David chose not to turn back. He kept telling himself the same lies of wanting to live up to the dreams of Maine or Gloria, but in reality it was all him living his own fantasies. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is a story of these false heroes, the ones who think that they're running towards one big goal, that think that they have a responsibility to fulfill, when in reality it's just them living out their own fantasies, hurting the people around them and living an empty life towards their own demise. That's their curse. Thank you all for watching.